Hi, I'm going to talk about empathy and cinema, which is a recurrent topic at the SESMI conferences for a good reason. My talk has two parts. In the second part, I will show you some findings that we got from our new work, which is currently under review. And in the first part, I will give you some background. It is going to be really brief because I don't have time. So please use the references if you want to know more. So let me first disappear. So we are talking about this space of empathy-related processes and about the question of how can we divide it in a way that will provide us a better, nuanced understanding of what empathy is. So one productive approach to tackle this issue is to look for an empirical boundary in the brain that distinguishes between distinct sets of empathy-related processes. If we can find a correlation or association between a specific set of empathy-related processes and the neural networks that supports it, then we are making a progress toward a more nuanced understanding of what empathy is. Now, the good news is that converging evidence points to the existence of such empirical boundary in the brain that distinguishes between experience sharing and theory of mind. Experience sharing refers to a process of somatic affective resonance of the state of another person. In Vittorio Gallese's term, it's a reuse of an afferent pathway bringing information from the internal organs in our body to our brain. So we can be sensitive to perturbations in the bodily homeostasis. If you feel some inconvenience when watching this image, you actually share or resonate some aspects of the bodily state or emotional state that this woman is going through. And the anterior parts of the insula and the mid-cingulate actually mediate this empathic process. And in the past year, we also got some causal evidence for the involvement of these two structures in experience sharing. Blocking or inhibition of these structures actually reverses empathic reactions of mice to the distress of a pure mouse. Theory of mind is the other mode of empathy-related processes. Theory of mind, you generate cognitive representation of another individual, including the beliefs, the intents, the motives, and so on. And the false belief task is the typical way to assess theory of mind capabilities. For example, you have a story about Anne and Joe. Anne's put the candy in the drawer, then she leaves the room. Then Joe takes it out and hides it in the box. And the question is, when Anne is back to the room, where will she look for the candy? Now, if you have theory of mind, you will answer, of course, she will look at the drawer. This is the place where she left it. But to do that, you need to have the ability to separate what you know about the world from what Anne is knowing about the world. So you have to create a separate cognitive representation of her mind. And this is a crucial difference between theory of mind or the cognitive mode of empathy, which actually requires as a precondition the ability to distinguish yourself from the object of empathy on the one hand, and experience sharing, which implicates a kind of fusion with the object of empathy. Now, there is a converging evidence to support the notion of dissociation between these two modes of empathy. The evidence includes anatomical findings, also behavioral findings, meaning that if you are a good mentalizer, it doesn't mean that you will perform good in experience sharing tasks. You also have evidence for dissociation between these processes along the developmental axis, the evolutionary axis, and also we have some brain lesion evidence that support this notion. This meta-analysis that was published in the past year supports the notion of dissociation between these two types of empathy-related processes. This meta-analysis summarized almost 200 studies, more than 4,000 participants, and it analyzed maps of brain activity obtained during the performance of empathy-related tasks. So they aggregated the maps and then they clustered them in a way that would produce something. It could produce one big cluster, it could produce many clusters, and that's how they conclude their analysis. At the highest level, they say, we suggest to capture social cognitive processes in terms of two overarching networks, which are flexibly combined and relate to more sensory affective type of empathy, aka experience sharing, versus more abstract and decoupled cognitive representation of the other's mental state. And these are the clusters that they found. On the left, you can see the one that is related to cognitive processing. On the right, affective or somatic processing. And these are distinct constellations in the brain. You also have an intermediate cluster, which combines both maps. Still, you have evidence for dissociation of two main modes of empathy. I would also like to mention some of our previous works in which we studied the dynamic relations between experience sharing and theory of mind-related networks in the context of film view. In this work, we used a scene from Stepmom, a sadness-inducing scene, and this was a data-driven analysis in which we didn't have a prior assumption about the location of the spatial constellation of the network. We were looking for sets of regions whose connectivity goes up when the emotion intensifies and the connectivity decreases when the emotion subsides. So we clustered regions and we find 7 networks. 2 of them showed a pattern of connectivity which is correlated with the sadness intensity in a new data set with different participants. And if you look at the neural constellation of these networks, the red one and the green one, they nicely correlate with the networks that you have in the meta-analysis that I showed you before. It's a data-driven analysis which associates the red network with mentalizing and theory of mind, and the green one with bodily empathy. Now, this work was presented in SCSMI conference by Talma Handler a few years ago. In this time, we had some hypotheses about the constellation of the network that we are interested in. We find that this horrific scene from Sophie's Choice, this is the rating. As the rating goes up, the connectivity within this extended network of experience sharing goes up as well. They are positively correlated, but surprisingly, the connectivity of the theory of mind network goes down when the drama intensifies. And this was surprising, but it was replicated 2 years later by a group led by Tanya Zinger, who used emotional films as well. And they found that the anterior insula, which is part of the experience sharing network, actually inhibited the temporoparietal junction, which is part of the mentalization network, particularly in condition of high negative emotionality. And they conclude that these are their words, in highly emotional situation, empathic sharing can inhibit mentalizing related activity and thereby harm mentalizing performance. Now, this is another study. I don't have time to talk about it, but we also found that the same pattern in the case of the Ring 2, a thriller among healthy controls in blue, but an inverse pattern in individuals with schizophrenia, which is partly related to symptoms. To summarize, experience sharing and theory of mind are related but separated capabilities. These processes may be co-activated during social interactions and film experiences, but they may also conflict under highly emotional conditions with clinical significance. Moving on to our new study, I would like to emphasize the difference. So in previous studies, we were interested in the dynamic interaction between these processes during cinematic experience. And here we were interested in temporal separation of the bodily cueing and the mentalizing. So we can have some causal evidence about the effect of bodily cueing on subsequent. So let's talk about the design. We scripted and shot 15 movies, 36 seconds each. Each movie had 2 versions, one with a dominant bodily soundtrack with crying, breathing, and so on, and the other with environmental sounds. Instead, the sounds were matched by pitch and volume, and each soundtrack included actually the 2 sources, but with different ratios, 90% for the bodily soundtrack and 10% for the environmental soundtrack in this case, and vice versa. So let me show you one example. This is the environmental sound. This is the alternative version with the bodily sounds. As I said, we shot 15 movies of that type. We showed them to 30 participants in an fMRI scanner. After the participants watched the movie, they were asked questions of 3 different types. In the control questions, like did the porter stop to rest on the stairs, the participant does not have to mentalize, does not have to establish cognitive representation of the characters. I can just directly answer this question. In the case of theory of mind question, I do have to mentalize. For example, when I answer a question like, is the woman afraid of the noise? I have to mentalize her emotions. In the case of cognitive theory of mind, I'm asked questions like, when the woman woke up, did she know where the noise is coming from? I need to simulate her cognitive state. The design was simple. Each movie was shown twice, then the questions in a counterbalanced way. The results. So here you see a contrast between the movies during the movie watching. In red, you can see what activated more when the Bodily soundtrack was played. So you can see actually not a lot of experience sharing related activations, nothing in the medial cingulate cortex that we expected to activate, some modest activation in the anterior insula or the inferior frontal gyrus, more activations across the mid and posterior insula, which are also implicated in interoception reading from the body, and also in the amygdala, which belongs to the extended experience sharing network. In the case of theory of mind questions, we got almost a textbook picture in which nicely replicates previous meta-analytical studies of this concept of theory of mind, temporal parietal junction, more frontal node of the temporal cortex, dorsal and ventral aspect of the medial prefrontal cortex. And this is not trivial to have. We operationalize this term in a unique way, and we got a replication in the replication crisis era. This is not trivial. Moving on to our main research questions, we were interested in whether the bodily soundtrack during the movies will affect the processing in subsequent phase of mentalizing. So we defined a set of brain regions related to these 2 types of empathy. We used these 2 meta-analyses for that. And then we ran a 3x2 repeated measure ANOVA with question type and movie type as factors. So we were looking for interaction, how the movie type in terms of soundtrack would affect the activity of these regions during the phase in which they were asked to answer questions. And we got 2 significant results after correction for multiple comparison, and I'm going to focus on one of them, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Here you see the activation of this region during the phase of control questions. And you can see that this region is not affected by the prior identity of the soundtrack. So this is environmental sound, and this is bodily sound, and no difference between these conditions. It also applies to cognitive theory of mind questions. Again, the activity of this region does not override with the type of soundtrack. But when the participant is asked to mentalize about the affective state of the character, there is a difference between the activity of this region after movies with bodily soundtrack and after movies without bodily soundtrack. So you can see that this region is much more activated after movies with soundtrack when the participant has to mentalize on emotions in relation to the same condition without bodily soundtrack and relation to other. This is an evidence for the modulation of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex by accentuation of bodily auditory cues that were provided during the original scene. We have similar results with the inferior frontal gyrus insula, but we don't have time for that. So our next question was, what is the functional significance of the findings about the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex? We asked whether the activity or coactivity of this region would correlate with better performance in answering theory of mind questions. We're in a psychophysiological interaction analysis. So we are looking for the coactivity, how this region co-activate with other regions in the brain during specific task. In this case, the task of process of answering affective or cognitive theory of mind questions. So the first level is looking for the coactivity with other regions. At the second level, we are asking whether the coactivity is correlated with better performance, or in which region in the brain the coactivity with the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex is related or associated with better performance. So this is what we found. Here you can see the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and the only region in the brain that co-activates with it in a way that is correlated with performance was the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, part of the theory of mind networks. So the more these regions were co-activated during effective theory of mind questions, the better was the performance, the more accurate were the participants in answering these questions. This was not the case with cognitive theory of mind questions, and it happened only when the movies contained bodily information, not after movies with environmental information. So it means that the more the upper and the lower parts of the medial prefrontal cortex are connected during answers on effective theory of mind questions, the higher the accuracy of this question is. And this happens only when the original movie contains bodily cues. So let's summarize. We need to be really cautious because we are under the danger of reverse inferencing here. So we can derive some ideas from these findings for future studies. The first point is the ventromedial dorsomedial connection may function as a gate through which prior effective somatic traces influence subsequent effective theory of mind. It's worth mentioning Antonio Damasio's famous concept of somatic marker in here. And Damasio argues that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the same region that we find to connect with the dorsomedial, like two components of the theory of mind network, the connection between them was actually correlated with performance in effective TOM questions. So what Damasio is saying is that this region, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is a critical node in a network that processes bodily intuitions that we develop for people, concepts, events, and so on. And we recollect the bodily information when we encounter these concepts, people, and so on, and we have to make decisions. Moving on to cinema, these findings suggest that maybe some affective bodily cueing functions as a kind of narrative focalizer, which establishes the centrality and salience of specific characters. If these characters are presented in the context of bodily cueing, maybe they become more salient to us. Maybe we develop a kind of bodily intuition toward these characters in a way that distinguishes these characters from other characters around. So this bodily intuition that we develop through the film toward specific characters may affect further mentalizing of these characters. And this effect may be not limited to the film itself, but also involve some post-viewing implications, some intuition that we keep when we mentalize about characters, about actors after the movie is over. So I'd like to thank my dear colleagues, Professor Talma Handler, Ophir Shani, Ayam Greental, Gadi Gilam, Daniela Perry, Maya Blaich Cohen, Moran Ovadia, Avichai Cohen for powering this experiment. And also I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, and thank you for listening.